this as part of your conversations, and love to take any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That was very, very informative. And I think we have, I hope people will chime in the chat room. I have kind of a complicated question I'd like to start off with. In terms of getting, in terms of taking action, a lot of what we do, as you know, is we want to bring constituents' voices into our member of Congress's office. And we want to focus on an economy-wide price on carbon, but we're bringing this message now that we also need to extract and store carbon. But we often get the most, sort of the most attention when we put it in terms of dollars and cents. For example, with farming, we've done a lot of work, we continue to do work to say, well, when a farmer transitions to regenerative practices, he can show, she can show, we can show that they actually make more money per acre. Mm-hmm. And then the member of Congress, likes to see that. That's an economic, piece of evidence. And here, so could you just comment on how to, what the constituency is, what the constituents look like that might go into that member of Congress's office, and what kind of message that they might be able to convey that is economic, Okay.
It's a great question, and your experience definitely aligns with our experience in the Forest Climate Working Group. That so many conversations on Capitol Hill, for starters, they begin from an economic base, and then they move to other values, other considerations. And so there is a similar story here that, excuse me, just think about a number of the things that I mentioned when we replant those forests in, take the last story that I just told about replanting forests in the lower Mississippi Valley. Right now, those lands that are those farmlands that are flooded all the time are actually claiming federal crop insurance. So they're actually taking money from the federal government. It's the only way that those lands are viable. They're actually not really good lands for farming. By, on the flip side, stepping in and helping that owner of that land turn that land into a forest, we're getting all the wonderful carbon benefits that I talked about, habitat benefits, water benefits, all these different benefits. But it's also more sustainable economically for the landowner, and more sustainable economically for the country. And that story exists all around the country. When I talked about increasing the use of wood as a building material instead of these more energy intensive building materials, it's undeniable that there will probably some industries that will see that as a step back. But for the forest products industry and for forest landowners, it's definitely an energizer economically. And if you think about particularly rural communities where it's very hard to create jobs, and one of the beauties of forests is that they're very distributed jobs, and you can create a lot of micro manufacturing and a lot of different people across rural areas who can participate. So it's a particularly effective way to create jobs in right now, where in many cases we need them the most. And the last thing I'll say, at least in some of the models that we've looked at, is that in the case of like California, where they're actually investing some of their cap and trade money in forests, as well as having a forest offset market, that's creating economic opportunities for landowners as well. And in many cases, for especially the smaller family forest owners, that little slice of additional payment for sequestering more carbon on their land can be the difference between them selling to a developer or not. So there are all sorts of interesting kind of domino effects in terms of the economic benefits and then how that ripples across what happens to the land.
Great, thanks. Can you see the comments in the chat?
Yeah, I can. These are wonderful questions. So let me. I think it's Klaus. Did I get that right? Asked a good question about lobbying efforts underway in the Pacific Northwest to manage federal forest land and about hazardous fuels reduction. So that ties back to a comment I made earlier and that one picture that I showed. And let me say that first of all, I would never want to just paint everything that might be proposed with a blanket brush or a broad brush, because you have to look at each proposal on its merits. And one thing our organization has been consistent on is saying that we have to look at each proposal for what we should be doing in our forest on its own merits, unique to that situation. But in general, the Pacific Northwest, which is a place that where fire was part of the landscape, but I think we've seen in recent years, fire's now part of the landscape in a way it hasn't maybe been, at least any time recently. Where you're having ash landing on people's windshields in Seattle. I think there's no question that the climatic regime is changing in the Pacific Northwest. That means we're going to have to make some adjustments to how we manage forests. And in some cases, that's probably going to mean more of this kind of fire preventative thinning than we've seen in the before. That's not the same thing as saying we need to go down and cut old growth forests down. That's not at all what we're talking about. And anyone who's sort of using this as a justification to say, well, we should be cutting these essentially carbon reserves, these giant trees down. Those two things don't connect. But there is no question that we're entering an era where there's going to be a need for more active management. Here's a statistic that I think you'll find interesting. In California, in just the last couple of years, they've had 102 million trees, 102 million trees that have died from the drought. And it's drought, which becomes, in some cases it's drought, and in some cases it's drought which weakens the trees and then pests get them. But 102 million trees that have been in one way or another killed connected to this drought. And so the way we manage forests and what we put back, in some cases after we've restored some of these forests, is going to have to be different. And that's a big part of the challenge ahead. So thanks, that's a great question. And for Lindsay asks a great question about the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. And the answer to that question is no, we haven't done that yet, but I would really love to. And there are some great folks on that caucus who, people we've known over the years individually, but I think it would be really interesting to see how the caucus might respond to this as, again, one of those bridge builder issues, one of those common ground issues that that everyone, I think, generally, really sees the importance of these kind of activities and sees it. I often talk about it as a real convenient truth, that a lot of the investments that we have to make here, these are things we really want to do anyway. They're good for the country. And so I would love the opportunity to engage with the caucus on that.
So then I would just ask could you be a little bit more specific about what you might ask of the caucus, or what kind of information? Would it mostly just to hear all of the things that you just laid out, or would you have a specific request that they hear from maybe the people in Appalachia that are reclaiming, or what? How would you see that happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, from my perspective, and you said this so well earlier, the best possible scenario, I think, is to let people tell their own story. And we have, one of the neat things about the Forest Climate Working Group is that we have a kind of a national a predominantly national membership. We actually do have a lot of regional groups that are members, but then we have this whole network of state level partners that they don't participate every time, but they're connected to us and they engage and they really are passionate about these issues. And so we do have people we can bring to tell their own story. But from my perspective, what I love about the way you all have approached things is, even though I know obviously Citizens Climate Lobby has a very distinctive legislative vehicle. You've also, I think, taken a patient approach in terms of educating people first before sort of asking people to necessarily, have to buy off on something the first time they hear about it. And I think from my perspective, what would be really valuable would just be for the bipartisan caucus to just hear essentially the kinds of things I just talked about and say, these are opportunities for us to address climate change. We can talk later about what's the right way to advance that. And by the way, there are a lot of existing federal programs that if we put federal dollars we already have into those programs at a greater scale, we could do a lot more of the things that I talked about. We actually don't need new legislation in some cases to do a lot of things I talked about. We just need to prioritize it as an investment. And so I think that I think we can just talk about these issues and let the power of the story tell itself, and then we can kind of ask people, does that sound compelling to you? And if so, what do you think? What do you think we should do about it? And really kind of let the solutions emerge from how people, the consensus that people would hopefully feel. So the next comment I see here is interesting ones about tourism dollars, and I think that that probably ties back to the earlier comment that I think you made, Jan, about the economic side, and that's another huge one, which is exactly right. That in some of the examples that I gave, in fact, in lower Mississippi, one of the things that those forests, after people replant a forest, in some cases there are certain people who will lease their lands out for hunting and fishing. That's as another source of income. There are many, many other examples of where recreating these systems becomes a tourism opportunity. In fact, in West Virginia, I saw a presentation from the Hatfield-McCoy Development District. And one of the things they've done is restored some of the land around them and created mountain bike and ATV parks. So that, there are all sorts of things that when you have a natural landscape around you, there are different kinds of recreational opportunities that become possible, and it's absolutely a significant source of tourism development. So Roger asks a really, really good question, and I think I probably touched this lightly, but probably too lightly, which is with increased temperatures and resulting increases in diseases, droughts, can we just take for granted that we'll be able to propagate the forest growth to sequester carbon? And the answer is absolutely not. No chance we can take it for granted. My way of putting it is that the no action alternative is the no forest carbon alternative. I mean, if we do absolutely nothing and just sit back, we're going to go backwards on this. I really feel confident in that. I think we're seeing it all around the country with what's happening and with the fires in the West, with incredible loss of forest to pests and diseases. In fact, here in Virginia, where I live, I was just out with some landowners over the last weekend, and they were talking about how they're cutting down big swaths of their trees that have been infected with pests. So there are just all sorts of things happening with our forests, and we're going to just have to invest at a higher level and understand that our forests are under assault, and climate change is a huge part of that. Climate change drives so many of these different stressors, and so it's ironic that when we need forests the most to slow climate change is when they're actually in some ways going to be the most challenged to provide it for us. So it's really back to my offense-defense way of putting it. While we're planting forests and while we're saying, hey, let's get more carbon, what do we do to get more carbon to these forests? We have to be thinking about how we're defending forests from all these threats and stressors that are coming at them. So Linda said, so Linda brings up a really, really important point. This is great. What a great question that is about. Okay, so you're planting a certain type of forest now, but the climate's going to be very different. 70 years from now, 100 years from now. How do you know that you're planting the right thing? And I sense maybe Linda might be from Minnesota if I read this question correctly. And in fact, interestingly enough, for 9 years now, I have been working with a group of scientists that actually are based out of northern Michigan, and it's a project that started looking at Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and the forests in those 3 states, to say, how do we pull together the science to project into the future what types of trees will be there in the future. It's called the Climate Change Response Framework, run by the U.S. Forest Service, but it involves state agencies and tribes and private landowners and all sorts of folks partnering together to basically say, let's see what the science tells us about what our forests are going to become, and then let's adaptively manage them over time. So instead of just sort of planting what's there now and then sitting back and waiting till trouble hits and then starting all over again, it's basically saying, how do we kind of manage that shift? How do we slowly start to introduce the species of the future now? And it's a really sophisticated system for doing that. And that's actually now set up in about half of the country. So not to say that therefore means it's a piece of cake and it's all done. But we do have some very sophisticated efforts that are about planting the right mix of species and adjusting that over time. And that lower Mississippi is one of those places where that's a huge thing that we're working on, is with those scientists to say, what should we be replanting and how should we be adjusting it, year by year. So another question from Kristen, building on Klaus's comment, about the Montana senators are working on forest management. Many experts have said that the burnt forest is actually storing carbon for a while, feeding the forest for a while until the next fire 100 to 300 years later. They're saying that the fire, beetle kill, et cetera, are all part of healthy forest. And Kristen, you're exactly right. Fire is absolutely part of a healthy forest. So let me just say that right off the top. And in fact, I think most forest experts, I think, would agree that keeping fire out of our forests has actually been one of the big problems. That the places where we're seeing these super fires are places where we actually didn't let the smaller scale fires burn frequently enough. So I just want to say that off the top, that although a lot of places, a lot of different types of forests around the country where fire is our friend and we actually need to use it as a management tool to prevent the super fire of the future. But what I would come back to in terms of, is a fire a good thing or a bad thing? One thing that we know is a bad thing is when are these super fires where, I'd love to have people with me right now who could talk to you about literally seeing soil melted into stone, which I first heard from a person who manages the water district for Aurora, Colorado. And he was trying to describe to me the level, the intensity of these fires and the devastation that have been wrought in the fires that surround the water supply for this city. And he said it literally melted soil into stone. And I've heard that in many other places as well. Of course, you understand the difference in productivity between soil and stone. And so, in fact, a lot of the post-fire restoration that we do is going back into places where if we didn't come back in there, a forest was not going to grow there again. It might grow junk, might grow head-high weeds, but was not going to grow a forest again without help. And so that's the type of fire we're seeing too much of and that we need to manage our way out of. So Jan's asking about, am I familiar with Dogwood Alliance? I definitely am. It's an organization I've known for many years, some good folks there, and the effort to prevent the cutting and export of the southern forest to Europe for wood pellet burning power plants. If yes, any comments on how much of a threat this sort of exporting is to our forest? That is absolutely one of the most complicated questions you possibly could have asked, and I want to handle it very carefully because I do know something about the topic, but there are people who have literally devoted their whole careers to this topic and to modeling out the exact carbon benefits of what carbon is lost here versus any gains that might be accomplished in displacing, fossil fuel use in Europe, et cetera. So I would actually commend the work of others to you to give you the most sophisticated view of this. But I have worked on biomass issues in other situations. And so this is what I want to say from my perspective, is that there's been a really unfortunate thing that's happened with biomass. It's kind of the opposite of the citizen climate lobby approach, which is to say, I'm going to say biomass is either the worst thing in the world or it's the best thing in the world, and there's nothing in between. And there have been some reports that have said biomass, any use of biomass is worse than fossil fuels. And then there are other people who say every use of biomass is a complete total replacement, carbon neutral replacement for fossil fuels. And my experience, which includes having authored something called the Community Wood Energy Program, which was about very small scale biomass targeted to things like having schools burn wood chips instead of hauling fuel oil across the oceans, is that there absolutely are uses of biomass where you're linking a forest to the right kind of use of that energy potential, and where that it's absolutely a benefit in terms of climate change. I believe that to my core. But I do also know there are examples on either end of the spectrum, some uses of biomass which are very poor energy use of that material and aren't energy efficient. And there are some that offer even bigger scale benefits than what I just described. So it's a real range. And like with a lot of things I've said, I'll give you the slightly unsatisfying answer of it. It depends. But I would say that of all the examples that I've seen, this large scale export of pellets in the Southeast is one where I've heard some of the most substantial concerns. And it does sound like there's some really, really challenging questions about that. Okay, I think I've got, it said 4 new questions, but I think I just see one more. Steph Miller posted a link, which I think is the, oh good, it's, might be the climate change response framework maybe there, or not exactly sure what those 2 links are, but let me just say that the Forest Service is a fantastic source of information on this. They have a climate change resource center. I guess that's the CCRC link that I see there, the top one. And oh, thank you. Steph just clarified. Yeah, that's what I meant to the Forest Service. And really great materials. I will tell you about one other one as well. It's called forestadaptation.org. Forestadaptation.org. It might have a www in front, I can't remember. This is the website for all those climate change response frameworks, and that will tell you about this kind of how do we manage forests through the changing weather, changing climate patterns ahead. Super interesting stuff.
So thank you. I actually have one more question. This is Jan. So sort of an action step. If we, in all of our, again, we're all organized by congressional district, and some of us have forested areas like in the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest. What would your advice be for those of us that would like to connect up with forest stakeholders that are making changes or engaged in forest management along the lines that you kind of outlined, and just kind of identify them in our communities and then somehow get their message, condense their message into some kind of message that could be communicated to our members of Congress? Probably the answer is it depends.
No.
But I mean, where we are, it's hard to know. I just think because a lot of us, maybe many of us that are even listening here, I think a lot of this is new to us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I'd like to offer myself and, in my roles as one of the leaders of the Forest Climate Working Group and someone who works for a forest organization, and with climate change, I think I mentioned this earlier, but maybe didn't finish the thought that the reason I came to this organization, American Forest, 5 months ago was because I wanted to be even more focused on climate change and forest than I had been able to be in my previous position, where it was most of what I did, but now it's like all of it's really the primary focus on what I'm doing and where I'm trying to help this organization go from the role that I play. And so if there's any way that I can be helpful, our organization can be helpful, Forest Climate Working Group can be helpful, I'd really love to do that. And that's just an open invitation from me to anyone here on the line who wants to reach out to me afterward. We have lists of those kinds of folks that you just mentioned, Jan, these more locally situated folks who think the same way, that, that in some cases might be able to introduce you to people or help you even know what to look for And in terms of that localized message, you know, I think I could provide some tools that might be helpful in shaping a message. But the beauty of it is this presentation, which I'd be very happy to share with anyone who's interested. I mean, if you think about it, it's a new story to a lot of people, but once you really think it through, it can be described in a very simple way. This is how much benefit we're getting from our forests. There are a couple simple things we need to do in terms of growing our forest and protecting the ones that we have, you know, and so it can be turned into a story that I think a lot of people could be able to deliver, and I'd love to help figure out ways to do that.
Yeah. Perfect. There's one more. So there's just one more question. Someone snuck in there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. It's funny you should say that. Liz just asked a great question about the rest of the world, and I actually had the chance during the halcyon days of climate action in the last administration to participate in a U.S.-Brazil summit. So the U.S. and Brazil, when they signed the agreement, and I think folks know that Brazil, you know, at times has been a driver of a lot of loss of forest carbon through deforestation, and then other times it's been a leader. It's kind of been on both sides of the coin. But the Obama administration, when they negotiated a pact with Brazil on climate change, it included that the two countries were going to work together and share ideas on forests. So I got to attend this session in New York City last fall, I guess it was, to sort of share our experience and what we have been doing and to hear what folks in Brazil have been doing. And the data that I saw at that time were very encouraging, that Brazil had been making this long-term improvement. I really was impressed by a lot of things I heard. It sounded really great. I've heard some things in the last 3 to 6 months that have been much more troubling in terms of what's happening in Brazil right now and some recent trends with tropical forests. So honestly, I'm sorting through that one myself. I'm so US focused, North America focused, that I don't spend too much time in those looking at what other countries are doing, but what I'm seeing from Brazil is complicated and honestly a little confusing right now.
Okay, I think we're almost at the hour. I wanted to let you know that we do record these, so I hope that hopefully I mentioned that to you. So these remarks and your slides will be available to anyone within CCL or anyone we might share it with, and hopefully that's fine with you. So they'll be able to see these slides. I thank you so much this was, in my view, is pretty incredible. And I want to let you know that we have everyone that's on the line. We have one more webinar in this series. Next week, we'll be hearing from Greg Page, who is a retired CEO from Cargill, a big agribusiness entity, and he should be giving us some perspectives from that sector, I think, which would be interesting. So I hope you'll attend. And again, I want to thank you very, very, very much. I think we'll be back in touch with you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Okay.